The goddamn decimal point wouldn't stay put. I stared at the numbers scrolling across my screen, digits of pi stretching out like a cosmic serpent, each one supposedly representing the unchanging laws of the universe. Only they weren't unchanging. Not anymore. There, nestled deep within the sequence, far beyond any practical application, was a deviation. Not a rounding error, not a glitch in the software, but a fundamental wrongness. A single misplaced digit, a tiny crack in the bedrock of reality. It started, as these things often do, with a question too stupid to ask. What is pi, really? Frank, my former colleague, sometime chess opponent, and the closest thing I had to a confidant these days, had posed it over a lukewarm beer. Not as a philosophical riddle, mind you, but as a genuine, almost childlike inquiry. He had that gleam in his eye, the one he got before launching into a 10-minute explanation of some obscure cryptographic principle. Frank, a former cryptographer for the army, approached the math of the universe like a coded message, and as I watched the numbers flow before me, I decided to go with his style. Before the event, before the 3-minute death, as the news anchors had so dramatically labelled it, I'd have shrugged off Frank's question. I was a theoretical mathematician, content in the realm of abstract concepts. Practical applications were messy. But the event had changed things. It had given me a purpose, or perhaps more accurately, a terrifying obsession. The 180 seconds of clinical death, shared they estimated by 65% of the planet, hadn't been frightening in itself. I'd woken up slumped over my keyboard, feeling more disoriented than anything, like waking from a dream you can't quite grasp. It was what happened during those 3 minutes that haunted me. Not the absence of anything, but the presence of something. The veil, we returners called it. A boundless white void, completely devoid of features, except for the shape. It wasn't a shape in any conventional sense. Imagine a tessellation, a geometric pattern, but one that constantly shifted, morphed, existing in dimensions beyond my comprehension. It wasn't simply complex. It was mathematically inconsistent, as if the rules of space itself were being rewritten before my eyes. That was the unsettling part, far more disturbing than the brief oblivion. And then, the world. Boulder was still Boulder. The Flatirons still jutted out against the sky. The Pearl Street Mall still hosted its usual assortment of street performers and overpriced boutiques. But everything was off. Quiet. The usual bustle was muted, replaced by a hushed unease that clung to the air like a shroud. You could see it in the eyes of strangers, the averted gazes, the almost imperceptible flinch when someone mentioned the event. The official line, of course, was that it was some kind of mass neurological event, a synchronized global seizure. Research was ongoing. Psychological support was available. Blah, blah, blah. The government, predictably, was trying to put a lid on the whole thing, funneling information through approved channels, downplaying the strangeness. But the returners, that's what we called ourselves, the ones who'd come back, we knew better. We shared the same experience, the same unsettling memory of the veil, the same knowledge. Not all of us, of course. Some were just empty. They came back changed, hollowed out. Others, though, they had things, skills, languages, premonitions, things they couldn't possibly have known before. Frank, thankfully spared that particular brand of global trauma, had simply carried on, albeit with a newly heightened awareness of the world's fragility. I'd been following the reports, the anecdotes filtering through online forums, and the conversations in the university corridors. I was still on indefinite leave, which was university speak for, "We're hoping you don't go completely mad on our payroll." Some returners could suddenly speak fluent Sumerian. Others could perform complex surgical procedures with no prior training. Vague premonitions of future events, usually short-term and often misconstrued, were almost commonplace. Me? I got the math. I traced the lines of equations scribbled across the whiteboard that now dominated one wall of my small home office. The room was a reflection of my singular focus, research papers piled haphazardly on the desk, empty coffee mugs forming a precarious ring around my laptop, the remnants of a half-eaten takeout container adding a subtle aroma of stale Thai food. It was an obsession. Frank, who has a great way of explaining complex things, said I was trying to see a crack in the simulation by observing numbers that only existed within the simulation, that I could not ever fully stand outside the issue. But I know what I am doing. The pi anomaly wasn't just a curiosity, it was a symptom. Something had fundamentally shifted during the event, a realignment of the cosmic machinery. And I, armed with my equations and a borrowed university computing cluster, was determined to find out what. I'd tried everything. Running the calculations on different platforms, using different algorithms, checking my code 1,000 times for errors. The anomaly persisted. It was like trying to repair a crack in a crystal structure. The more I manipulated it, the more the entire thing threatened to shatter. Then came the message. A single line of seemingly random characters left as a comment on a niche online forum where I'd posted a heavily sanitized version of my findings. I'd initially dismissed it as spam, the digital equivalent of a crank call. But something about it nagged at me. A pattern, perhaps, a structure beneath the apparent chaos. That's when I'd called Frank. He'd come over, squinting at the string of characters with that focused intensity that made him look like a hawk spotting its prey. He'd spent years breaking codes for the army, deciphering encrypted communications, finding hidden messages in seemingly random noise. "It's a cipher, Julian," he'd said after a long silence, his voice quiet but firm. "Heavily encrypted, multiple layers, military grade probably." And that's where we were. Me, fixated on the stubborn decimal point. Frank studying the encrypted gibberish on his screen, a half-empty beer beside him. This cipher felt like more than just a mathematical puzzle. "We need answers," I said, more to myself than to him. Frank looked up, a glint in his eye. "I know a guy, retired NSA, still has his ear to the ground. We should pay him a visit." He didn't need to elaborate. The implications were clear. This was escalating fast. "Ready to take a trip down the rabbit hole, Julian?" Frank asked, a rare smile playing on his lips as he stood. I keyed in my access code, shutting down the link to the university computing cluster. I glanced around my office at the chaotic refuge of equations that were both my torment and my salvation. "I think I'm already halfway there, Frank," I said, following him out. The streetlights cast a warm glow on the pavement as we walked towards my battered but reliable Volvo. The cipher was a key. We just needed to find the lock it opened. The drive to Morrison was a study in silent tension. The foothills rolled past, their familiar shapes somehow ominous in the twilight. Frank, typically a man of few words even during our chess matches, was even quieter than usual. His hands gripped the steering wheel with a tightness that belied his calm demeanor. I, on the other hand, was a jumble of nervous energy. The misplaced decimal point in pi still burned in my mind, a cosmic typo that threatened to unravel everything I thought I knew. "He's expecting us," Frank said, breaking the silence as we neared the turnoff. "Goes by Clark. Don't ask about his real name. He doesn't use it anymore." The name conjured images of a wizened old hermit, a digital oracle living off-grid. The reality, as we pulled up to a nondescript ranch house, was somewhat different. The house was modern, clean-lined, with solar panels glinting on the roof. A well-tended garden, surprisingly lush for the Colorado climate, flanked the driveway. There were no visible signs of high-tech security, no fences or cameras, just a sense of isolation. Clark himself was younger than I'd imagined, perhaps mid-50s, with a lean build and a neatly trimmed salt and pepper beard. His eyes, though, held the weight of someone much older. They were a piercing blue, sharp and intelligent, and they seemed to see right through me. He wore jeans and a plain dark-colored t-shirt, the uniform of someone who valued practicality over appearances. He greeted us with a curt nod, leading us inside without a word. The interior of the house was Spartan but comfortable. Minimalist furniture, a large uncluttered desk, and walls lined with bookshelves filled with everything from mathematical texts to classic literature. No screens, no obvious technology, except for a single antiquated-looking computer terminal tucked away in a corner. It looked like something out of a Cold War museum. "Frank tells me you're a mathematician," Clark said, his voice surprisingly soft, almost gentle. He gestured towards two chairs facing his desk. "And that you've stumbled upon something interesting." I hesitated, glancing at Frank. He gave me a subtle nod, a reassurance. I pulled out my laptop, opened the file containing the pi anomaly, and explained my findings, my voice trembling slightly despite my efforts to sound confident. I detailed the deviation, the rigorous checks I'd performed, the inescapable conclusion that something was fundamentally wrong with the fabric of reality. Clark listened intently. He didn't interrupt, didn't dismiss my findings, didn't offer the usual platitudes about mass hysteria or cognitive distortions that I'd heard from some of my former colleagues. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You're seeing the seams, Dr. Croft," he said finally. "The places where the simulation doesn't quite hold together." The word simulation hung in the air. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact. "You know about it?" Clark gave a slight smile, a hint of sadness in his eyes. "I know of it. I've seen glimpses. I spent years mapping the digital landscape, charting the currents of information. I saw anomalies, patterns that shouldn't exist, things that defied the laws of physics, the laws of logic." "The event," Frank interjected. "It amplified those anomalies, didn't it?" Clark nodded. "It was a stress test of sorts, a brief, catastrophic failure of the system. It revealed the underlying architecture, however briefly, and it left residue, the returners. You're the cartographers of absence, Dr. Croft. You're mapping the void, the space between the code." He gestured towards the ancient computer terminal in the corner. "That machine," he said, "is connected to a network. Not the internet, not anything you'd recognize. It's a backdoor of sorts, a way to access the raw data stream, the underlying code of the simulation." I stared at the terminal. It was a relic, a dinosaur of technology, and yet it held the key, potentially, to understanding everything. "Can you decrypt this?" I asked, handing Clark a printout of the encrypted message I'd received. Clark took the printout, his eyes scanning the string of characters. He didn't use the computer, he simply looked at it. It was as if he were deciphering the code directly with his mind, bypassing the need for any technological interface. After several minutes, a long, tense silence, he looked up. "It's a coordinate," he said. "A location, within the simulation." "A location? What kind of location?" Frank asked, leaning forward. "A test chamber, I believe," Clark replied. "A place where the system is monitored, adjusted." "Can we get there?" I asked, my voice rising with excitement and dread. "Can we see it?" "It's risky, Dr. Croft, extremely risky. The system doesn't like to be observed. It has defenses." He described his theories in how one might be able to travel to this coordinate. He did not talk about his past or explain how he knew these things. He simply stated them. "But you've done it," Frank said. Clark looked down at his hands. "I've touched the edges. I've seen things that cannot be unseen." "I need to see it, Clark," I said, my voice firm. "I need to understand." Clark looked at me, his blue eyes filled with recognition, a shared understanding of the burden of forbidden knowledge. "Very well, Dr. Croft. I'll show you the way. But be warned. Once you cross that threshold, there's no guarantee you'll come back the same." He turned toward the antiquated terminal, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. Clark engaged the ancient terminal, keying data to the old machine. Lines of code, cryptic and unfamiliar, scrolled across the green, monochrome screen. It was a language I didn't recognize, a level of programming beyond anything I'd encountered. It was like watching a master weaver at a loom, creating a web of digital reality. "This isn't just code," I murmured, mesmerized. "It's structure. The framework itself." Clark nodded without looking up. "It's the language of the originators," he said. "The ones who built this place." The word originators hung in the air. It was one thing to suspect a simulated reality. It was another to consider the beings, the entities, responsible for its creation. My mind struggled to grasp the concept, the sheer scale of such an undertaking. "How does it work, Clark? This transportation?" Clark paused, his fingers resting on the keyboard. "It's not physical transportation, Dr. Croft," he corrected. "It's a redirection, a shift in perception. We're essentially changing our designated location within the simulation, moving our awareness to a different location within the data stream." He explained that the terminal wasn't directly altering the simulation's code. It was exploiting existing pathways, hidden backdoors, and dormant functions within the system. It was like using a cheat code in a video game, only instead of gaining infinite lives, we were accessing a hidden level, a developer's room where the rules of the game were laid bare. The old computer had been modified, rebuilt many times. "The coordinate in the message," Clark continued, "is a specific address, a point within the simulation's architecture where the system is vulnerable. It's where the monitoring and adjustment processes take place. Think of it as a control room, or perhaps a server farm, for reality itself. The idea of accessing such a place, of seeing the machinery of our existence laid bare, was both exhilarating and terrifying." "What about the defenses?" I asked, remembering Clark's warning. "The system is self-aware to a degree," Clark explained. "It has mechanisms to detect and neutralize anomalies, threats to its stability. Think of it as an immune system or perhaps a firewall. It can manifest in various ways: distortions in perception, manipulation of sensory input, even direct physical consequences." "So what, we could get deleted?" Frank asked, his voice surprisingly calm. Clark gave a grim smile. "Deleted is a simplistic term, but yes, essentially. Our awareness could be disassembled, reintegrated into the system, or simply lost." I took a deep breath, trying to calm the rising tide of fear. I looked at Frank, his face stoic and determined. "I'm ready," I said. Clark entered a final sequence of commands, the code on the screen flashing rapidly. The edges of the room softened, the sharp lines of the bookshelves and desk blurring as if viewed through a warped lens. It wasn't a dramatic distortion, but a subtle bending of reality, a visual precursor to the chaos to come. "Prepare yourselves," Clark said. "It will be disorienting." The world dissolved. Not in a flash of light or a dramatic explosion, but in a slow, gradual unraveling. The objects in Clark's office, the bookshelves, the desk, the ancient terminal, lost their solidity, their sharpness of detail. They became blurred, indistinct, like a watercolor painting left out in the rain. Colors changed, morphing into unnatural hues. Then came a complete absence of sensory input. It was like being suspended in a void, the most profoundly isolating experience I could imagine. I was nothing but a point of awareness, a disembodied consciousness adrift in a sea of nothingness. Then, slowly, gradually, something began to coalesce. At first, it was just a distant light in the infinite void. Then it grew, expanded, taking on shape and form. It was the architecture. It wasn't a physical structure, not in any conventional sense. It was a network of interconnected nodes, glowing with light and energy. It resembled a neural network, a colossal brain, but built on a massive scale. Lines of light carrying the data of entire civilizations, their histories, their thoughts, their very existence, streamed between nodes that shimmered with the complexity of 1,000,000,000,000 interconnected universes. I could see the patterns, the underlying mathematics, the misplaced decimal point in pi. The anomaly that had led me here was a tiny flaw, a ripple in this vast ocean of code. And I could see other flaws, other inconsistencies scattered throughout the architecture. But it wasn't just a network of data. It was dynamic, constantly adapting, correcting, refining itself. And I could sense the presence of something else, something powerful, lurking within the architecture. It was the self-preservation mechanism, the firewall Clark had spoken of. It was reactive to our presence, to our intrusion. "We're being watched," I said, my voice a thought, a projection of consciousness. I didn't need to speak, we were connected, our minds linked within this digital realm. "I know," Frank replied, his thought equally clear. "Stay focused. We need to find the control room, the monitoring center." We were close, I could feel it. We were on the verge of uncovering the truth, the reality behind the illusion, but the closer we got, the more dangerous it became. The architecture was closing in, the firewall tightening its grip. The question was, could we find what we were looking for before the system found us? Navigating the architecture was like swimming through a sea of light and information. Data streams flowed around us, each a universe of experience, containing lives lived and unlived. The scale was overwhelming, crushing. I felt like an ant trying to comprehend the workings of a supercomputer. Frank kept us focused. Clark said it was a test chamber, a monitoring center. Look for patterns, anomalies, anything that stands out from the background noise. The background noise was the constant noise of the simulation, the billions of lives playing out their roles. It was a multitude of thoughts, emotions, experiences, all flowing through the architecture's intricate network. But amidst this chaos, I began to discern a subtle order, a pattern that resonated with the coordinates Clark had extracted. "There," I said, directing our awareness towards a region of heightened activity. "It's like a nexus, a convergence point." As we approached, the architecture shifted, reconfiguring itself. The data streams intensified, swirling around us like a vortex. The sense of being watched, of being scrutinized, became stronger. The firewall was active, probing, testing us. I could feel it trying to isolate us, to compartmentalize our awareness, to break the link between Frank and me. "Hold on," Frank's thought resonated, a steadfast anchor in the swirling chaos. "Don't let it separate us." We reached the nexus. It wasn't a room, not in any physical sense, but a zone of intensified reality. The data streams here were clearer, more defined, forming recognizable patterns, images, and even voices. It was like a control panel, a monitoring station where the parameters of the simulation could be observed and, presumably, adjusted. I saw Earth, rendered in intricate detail, a sphere suspended in the digital void. I could zoom in, focusing on specific locations, specific individuals. I saw my apartment in Boulder, my messy office, the whiteboard covered in equations. I saw Frank, back in Clark's house, his physical body sitting motionless before the ancient terminal, his awareness linked to mine. But there was something else. Something watching. Not the firewall, not the system's automatic defenses, but something more. Conscious. It wasn't a physical presence, but a sense of awareness, a vast, dispassionate intelligence observing the simulation. "The Originators," I said, the word a silent realization. They weren't malevolent, not in the way we typically understand the term. They weren't gods or demons or alien overlords. They were scientists, researchers, observers. We were their experiment, their subjects in a vast cosmic study of consciousness and free will. The realization hit me. The event, the 3-minute death, wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate intervention, a test. They wanted to see how a statistically significant portion of humanity would react to a profound, shared, unexplained near-death experience, and the potential for existential questioning it would trigger. It wasn't about revealing the truth of the simulation, but about observing the ripple effects of widespread uncertainty and the search for meaning. I saw the data flowing from Earth, the metrics of those reactions, the fear, the confusion, the denial, and the nascent, often misdirected, attempts at understanding. I saw the rise in conspiracy theories, the subtle shifts in social order, the surge in philosophical and religious inquiry, all reactions to the unexplained, and I saw my own data stream, My equations, my unique attempts to understand the underlying structure of the simulation, flagged as an anomaly, a significant point of interest because I was going beyond the intended parameters of the test. "They're studying us," I said, my thought filled with awe and terror. "They're observing how we respond to the unexplained event." "And what do they do with that information?" Frank asked. "What's the end game?" I didn't know. I could see no clear purpose, no grand design beyond the act of observation itself. The originators weren't interested in controlling us, in manipulating our destiny. They were simply watching, learning. But the act of observation, I realized, was itself a form of interaction. My awareness of being watched, my attempts to understand the simulation, were altering the experiment, changing the parameters. I was no longer a passive subject. I had become an active participant, unintentionally shaping the reality I was trying to understand. Suddenly, the architecture changed again, violently this time. The firewall intensified, focusing its attention on us with laser-like precision. The data streams became erratic, threatening to overwhelm our awareness. We've been compromised. We were no longer just observers, we were anomalies, threats to the system's stability. The firewall was closing in, attempting to neutralize us, to erase our presence from the architecture. I could feel my awareness fracturing, the link to Frank weakening. "Clark!" I sent the thought out, a desperate plea. "Pull us back!" The dissolution was abrupt, terrifyingly so. One moment, I was immersed in the architecture, struggling against the onslaught of the firewall. The next, I was gasping for air, my physical body convulsing, back in Clark's ranch house. My head throbbed, my vision swam, and I felt a profound sense of disorientation, as if my mind had been ripped from one reality and slammed into another. Frank was beside me, his face pale but composed. He helped me sit up, offering a glass of water. "You okay, Julian?" I took a shaky sip, the cold water grounding me, anchoring me back to the physical world. I think so," I managed. "What happened?" "Clark pulled us out," Frank explained. "Just in time. You were fading, losing coherence." Clark stood by the ancient terminal. He looked exhausted, the lines on his face etched deeper than before. "The system is adaptive," he said. "It learns, it anticipates, it becomes more efficient at neutralizing threats." I looked around the room. The world felt different, sharper, more real, and yet simultaneously more fragile, more contingent. The knowledge of the architecture, of the observers, had irrevocably altered my perception. "They're not controlling us," I said, the realization still echoing in my mind. "They're just watching." Clark nodded. "Observation is their purpose. The simulation is an experiment, a vast ongoing study of consciousness, of free will. The event was a catalyst, a deliberate perturbation to see how we would react." "But why?" Frank asked, the same question I'd grappled with in the architecture. "What's the point of it all?" Clark shook his head. "I don't know. I've seen the machinery, the framework, but I haven't seen the blueprint. I don't know the ultimate goal of the originators. Perhaps there isn't one. Perhaps they're simply driven by curiosity, by the same desire for understanding that drives us." The implications were profound. We were living in a constructed reality, a carefully crafted experiment. But we weren't puppets on strings. We had free will, agency, the capacity to make choices, even to challenge the very nature of our existence. The originators were observing those choices, studying the emergent properties of consciousness, but they weren't dictating the outcome. "But we changed things," I said, remembering the surge of the firewall, the system's reaction to our intrusion. Our awareness, our observations altered the experiment. "Yes," Clark agreed. "You became a variable, an anomaly. You introduced an element of unpredictability. That's why the system reacted so strongly. It's not just about preserving its stability. It's about maintaining the integrity of the experiment. The encrypted message, the coordinates, the journey into the architecture. It had all been a consequence of my initial observation, the misplaced decimal point in pi. My curiosity, my drive to understand, had unintentionally triggered a cascade of events, exposing me to the underlying reality and, in turn, altering that reality itself. "So what now?" Frank asked. I looked at him, then at Clark. I didn't have a clear answer. I couldn't go back to my old life, to the comfortable ignorance of the pre-event world. The knowledge I'd gained, the glimpse of the architecture, had changed me irrevocably. But I also couldn't simply continue my research, my attempts to unravel the simulation's secrets. The system was aware of me now, and any further direct interaction would likely be catastrophic. "We adapt," I said finally. "We learn to live with the knowledge, with the uncertainty." It wasn't a grand solution, a heroic defiance of the originators. It was a quiet acceptance, a recognition of our limitations, but also of our agency. We were part of the experiment, but we were also individuals with our own thoughts, our own emotions, our own capacity for meaning. Clark nodded. "The simulation is a self-correcting system," he said. "It will adapt to your presence, to your knowledge. It will recalibrate. The question is, how will you recalibrate?" He began powering down the old machine, the glow of the screen fading. The connection to the architecture was severed, at least for now. The room returned to its previous state of quiet isolation. The only evidence of our journey, the lingering tension in the air, the shared knowledge that weighed heavily on our minds. I left Clark's house with Frank, the Colorado sky a vast, indifferent expanse above us. The world looked the same, but my perception of it had been fundamentally altered. I was no longer simply a mathematician, a seeker of abstract truths. I was a participant in a cosmic experiment, an observer of the observers, a conscious element within a manufactured reality. The decimal point in pi, the seemingly insignificant anomaly, had led me to the edge of existence, to the very architecture of absence. And in that absence, I had found a new kind of meaning, a fragile, contingent understanding of my place in the universe, a universe that was both more and less than I had ever imagined. The remainder of infinity, the part beyond the neatly defined equations, was where I now lived. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that the observation went both ways.